Hi, I'm Matt Barry. I'm an independent filmmaker, and this is Low Budget Visions, where we celebrate personal DIY independent filmmaking. I'm joined today by Michael Glover Smith. Michael is an independent filmmaker, author, and teacher, currently based in Chicago. And he recently made the film Relative, which is out now digitally. And so, Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you for an introduction.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm a fan of the show, so it's an honor to be here. Like you said, I'm Michael Glover Smith. I'm a Chicago-based filmmaker, author, and teacher. I've made four feature films since my first feature, Cool Apocalypse, in 2014, and the most recent one is Relative, which had its premiere in 2022 and just became available to stream through our distributor, Music Box Films. So that's it's very exciting.
Great. We can kind of get started talking about Relative. I'd love to hear about the making of the film, really delve into any details that you would like to share. One of the things that I like to do on this podcast, on this show, is to kind of talk about the production process for anybody who's thinking about maybe making their first film or maybe making their first feature or making the move into doing a slightly bigger budget feature. So at any of those levels, I think these are interesting things to learn about. So with that said, what was tell us where did the idea for Relative start? Where did the project begin?
Well, it started with really the impulse to make a movie about a family. That was kind of a subject I had never explored before, but I'm really fascinated by relationships. And so making films about parent-child relationships and siblings was really appealing to me because it seemed like a challenge, was something I just hadn't done before. But this was also my fourth, feature length film. And the thing about independent filmmaking, like anything, you get better the more you do it. So I think with each of the four features I've made, I've gotten a little bit smarter about how to do it, regardless of what the budget level is. This was not the highest budget film I've made, but it also was not the lowest. And yet it was the one that was really probably the most satisfying to make, just from the the point of view of a writer, director, producer who felt like I was kind of putting it all together for the first time in a way that it just was a great experience for everybody who worked on it.
Something I really liked about the film was how you captured these interpersonal dynamics between the family. The premise of this family coming together on the occasion of the youngest son's graduation from college, and how their lives have kind of catch up with each other and intersect in some ways, and we learn a bit about what they're all going through at this point in their lives. Were you drawing on any kind of personal experiences in writing that, and also in developing the characters? Did you have any actors in mind as you were writing?
Um, yes and no to both questions. I always say the film is more personal than it is autobiographical. Meaning the exact situations that you see are pretty much all fictional, but it's all kind of based on emotions and that I know to be true, and based on the kind of family dynamics that I know to be true, even though the characters are not. It's not like that's me and my own family up there. Um, and then in terms of did I write for any actors? Yes, Claire Cooney, who plays Yvonne, the younger sister, that part was written for her. I had actually worked with her a couple of times before this. And whenever you have a good experience working with an actor, you always want to repeat that because it gets easier and easier every time. And I think you also kind of start to become aware of like what that person can do, and you even start to feel like that you can somehow push them in a way maybe beyond what they think they can do. And so it just gets easier every time. So I wrote the part of Yvonne for Claire, Who else? I mean, most of the actors auditioned, it was mostly a traditional audition process. The other part that I actually did write for someone was the role of Hecla for the young actress Elizabeth Stamm. And that was based on, I saw her in a low budget independent film called Bleed American. That was kind of about white trash, teenagers living in trailer parks in Indiana. Very kind of raw and gritty, realistic kind of Larry Clark-esque slice of life film. And it's, her performance was a dramatic performance, but I saw it at a film festival and I started talking to her afterwards and I couldn't believe how funny she was in real life, just the complete opposite of what I had seen on the screen. And I thought, oh man, I think I know how I can use her energy, because I had not yet started. I kind of knew what I wanted relative to be, but I hadn't actually started writing the script. So I knew there was going to be the character of a girlfriend for Benji, the main character, but I wasn't her. Well, I wasn't sure who that would be. And then after I met Liz, it was like, oh, it needs to be this person.
Did you find as you were going through the casting process that did you see certain actors who just instantly struck you as like that would just that's exactly what I had in mind?
Yeah, for some of them, I mean, there are a couple actors I should point out. We offered roles to, like Wendy Roby, who plays the mom. She's one of my favorites. I'm a huge fan of Twin Peaks, and I had seen her in that when I was a kid. So you know that role we just straight up offered her, through her agent. And same thing with the actor who plays her husband, Fran Guinan. I had seen him in countless movies, TV shows. I had seen him on stage at a play here at the Steppenwolf Theater in Chicago. And then for I think most of the rest of the roles, it was a traditional casting process. Like Claire Cooney, who plays Yvonne, was actually the casting director, so she was able to funnel a lot of really talented actors our way. And this was like during the early days of COVID. So um, I think the first round for everybody was just submitting self tapes. And then Claire and I kind of made notes about who we liked, who we didn't like, and who we wanted to see read again. And then we kind of had the second round, we did chemistry reads, and that was all in person.
Okay. As far as your writing process is concerned, do you have a kind of a method that you use as you're developing a script, or do you find that a lot changes from your first draft to your final shooting script?
I usually wait until I know what's going to happen before I start writing. So that's my methodology, is to sort of collect ideas and wait until um, all of those ideas start to connect with one another in my brain. And once I know what the beginning, middle, and end is going to be, then I start writing. So the first draft, the process goes very fast, because I'm a firm believer in the philosophy that writing is basically rewriting. So I think if you get the first draft down as fast as possible, then it's a lot easier to rewrite something that's bad than it is to come up with something out of thin air. Staring at a blank page, that's kind of the hardest part.
Sure. I'm
But
curious.
but to answer the other part of your question, I
Yeah.
mean, this script went through many drafts. Like I typically go through 20 plus drafts of every script that I write, and this was no exception.
Gotcha. Um, Something I'm curious about is as you got your final script in place and you're starting to look at casting, could you talk a little bit about the financing process? Anything that you can talk about, that you can share? I mean, about that. Anything about getting to the point where you're raising the money that you need, budgeting. I think this is always something that's of interest to independent filmmakers to think about. Uh,
Yeah, but it's crucial, and a lot of filmmakers are kind of cagey when it comes to money. But because that's what the premise of your show is, I'll be totally transparent with you. Our budget was $75,000, which is low. That's a low budget film, and most people who are involved in film production who I've talked to have told me they think it looks like it costs a lot more than that. And that, is really the ultimate compliment, because it just goes to show how well we scheduled everything. We shot the whole movie in 11 days. Um, so it was a very fast shoot, but we did a lot of prep. And also, the thing about writing a low budget independent film is I have learned how to write for the budget. When I first started making movies, I kind of would just write a script and not even think about how much it would cost. I would write it and I would think, oh, well, I'll eventually show this to a producer and they'll come up with the budget and then we'll try and find the money. And now it's kind of the other way around. Now it's kind of like I try and think of how much money I can raise, and then it's like, what's the best movie I can make for that budget level? So
Right.
that's kind of how and with Relative, I had a really good producer named Aaron Wertheimer, who you should have on this show. He's made three kind of micro budget comedy features that are really funny, really absurd. But it was a real game changer for me to have a director produce my film, because he understands, like, how to produce a film with a director's mindset. Like he knew where to cut corners um, and how to just schedule everything. So we shot 7 days out of the 11-day shoot. Were shot inside the house that's the main location, or in the immediate surrounding area, and then everything else was shot in 4:8. Aside from that, but when you watch the movie, it's kind of like I think you don't really realize how much of it is set in the house, because there are scenes that take place elsewhere, the library, the college, the bar, and those are kind of like sprinkled throughout at pretty regular intervals, so it doesn't feel too claustrophobic or too um, or just too married to that one location.
Just real quick, speaking of location, I was wondering what the process was of finding those. Did you have anything in mind as you were writing, or I mean, I imagine you were working with a location scout perhaps to find some of the final places you use. Could you talk a little bit about that process?
Yes, I had no location scout. It was all me.
Oh, okay.
But I do live in the neighborhood where we shot most of the film, and that made it very easy. The neighborhood is called Rogers Park, and it's actually the neighborhood that is furthest north in the city of Chicago before you end up in the northern suburbs. And so a big inspiration for the script was the house. Although I didn't know exactly which house we were going to shoot in, there are a bunch of these old, beautiful Victorian homes, some of which, like the house we shot in, were built in the 19th century. And so I walk past these houses all the time, and just kind of fantasize about who might live there. And that's sort of how the Frank family was born. Um, was just kind of meditating on what it would be like to grow up in a house like that.
Nice.
And then the process of finding the house, it was just luck. I mean, the house where we shot the film is a historic house. It's kind of an interesting side note, but the architect, or the guy who built the house, he was the electrical contractor who supplied the electricity to the Chicago World Fair in 1893. He was the
Wow.
only electrical contractor in the state of Illinois, because electricity was still like a brand new thing at that time. And so it's a really beautiful old house, and it's been really kind of immaculately, you know, maintained and restored over time. And one day, a friend of mine was just walking down the street, and she saw a guy coming out of that house, and he's one of the two owners, and he started talking to her about her dog. And then she just kind of, he seemed like a friendly guy, and she said, "Hey, a friend of mine is looking to shoot a movie in a Victorian house like yours. Would you ever consider giving it up to a filmmaker?" And he said, "Sure." And so she literally just like took some photos of the house on her cell phone and sent them to me. And we really lucked out that the couple who lived there were really gracious about letting us invade their home for a full week.
Yeah, I'm curious, were there any particular challenges in shooting in a historic home like that? Were there any, I'm not sure if if there's a designation that has certain requirements that you have to follow for filming inside the house or anything that you can, do to accommodate that.
No, not really. I mean, the owners were they had not owned it for a long time. They had owned it for I think a couple years, and they were sort of in the process of restoring it when they agreed to let me shoot there, and then that sort of gave them inspiration to really fix it up and make it look nice before we before we showed up. And they had extra time because this was the early days of COVID, so we actually had to postpone the shoot by 13 months. We were originally going to shoot in May of 2020, and then we were all cast, crewed up. We had found all the locations, and then COVID happened, so we postponed first by 3 months. I said, okay, we'll shoot it, late summer, and then because we thought COVID was going to go away, but then it didn't. So I said, okay, we're going to postpone until next spring, and then that gave them time to really make everything immaculate. So no, it was just we just wanted to be courteous. We wanted to make we wanted everything to be as clean as it was when we first arrived, and you know everyone was on their best behavior, so it all worked out.
Great. Talking about those kind of unusual production circumstances because of COVID, first I wanted to go back for a minute and ask, did you have a rehearsal period with your actors? You mentioned that you were able to shoot very quickly. Were you able to do a rehearsal period with the actors, and could you, if so, could you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, we did because it was COVID, we did mostly Zoom rehearsals. We there were certain key scenes that I thought were kind of tricky. Like the scene between Rod and his girlfriend Sarah on the porch where she explodes and yells at him. There are certain scenes like that where I always feel like I really need to spend time talking to the actors in advance. I don't want to rehearse it for the first time on set. I really want to, talk to them about the emotional dynamics and hear what they think about it, and just so we all know we're on the same page before we show up to location. So that we did via Zoom. There were scenes between Wendy Roby and Claire that we did via Zoom. The scenes where the mother and daughter are in the kitchen talking, and then afterwards when they go on their midnight jog and they kind of flop down on the lawn and have that heart to heart conversation. They rehearsed those via Zoom, and then Benji and Hecla, um, they rehearsed. They both live not too, or at that time they both lived not too far from where I live, so they came over and we rehearsed in my backyard. We did kind of the the scenes of them at the bar, because I wanted to make sure that they had the right kind of romantic chemistry. um so those were the only scenes we really rehearsed in advance, although the big fight scene between Benji and Rod, that had been the scene that I had the actors do during callbacks. So that was almost like a rehearsal, because we had cast the older brother first, Keith Gallagher, who plays Rod. And it was kind of, casting Benji, it was like, who has the right, brotherly chemistry with this guy. And it was fascinating because Cameron, who plays Benji, he and Keith, they both have curly brown hair and blue eyes, and just like seeing them next to each other talking, they look alike. I felt like they were brothers, and that's why having chemistry reads, I think, is important.
When you mentioned that the shoot had to be postponed for, you said 13 months, is that right?
Yeah.
Into like basically spring of 2021, is that correct?
June of
June.
2021 is when we shot, and
Okay.
during that time, we lost a location. We were originally supposed to shoot in a really nice university library. It was like huge windows, and then we ended up, shooting in a very small kind of suburban library. So that just, that's one aspect of the film that changed. Although I think where we ended up shooting was more appropriate for that character. And then, a couple of actors dropped out, and we had to hire other people to play those roles. But for the most part, everybody who had originally signed on, they stuck around, and they came back because they were excited to do it. So I was lucky.
Yeah, I was wondering what that process looked like at that point. I mean, did you find, I mean, obviously, I'm sure there were a lot of challenges. Were there anything in particular that you really found that you had to work around with any kind of restrictions or anything like that that were in place?
Yeah, I mean, this was a SAG, film. So the SAG rules were very strict about what you had to do, and unfortunately, those rules are geared more towards, big budget Hollywood films and television shows. Like they don't really make compromises for, micro budget independent films. So when when we planned on shooting it in June of 2021. This was also right after everyone had gotten vaccinated. I think the vaccines became available in April or something like that. So everybody got vaccinated, and we thought it was over. We thought we were all kind of out of the woods. But then, because the variants, Omicron and all that,
Right.
that was still later in the summer. Um, but SAG, basically told us, okay, you have to hire a COVID safety officer. Well, that was another $1,000+ to, hire someone to be there on set for every day. And we had to, just it was like that person had to take everyone's temperature at the very beginning of the day, and had to sanitize all the equipment and so on and so forth. But the hardest thing was everyone who ever stepped foot on set had to be vaccinated twice before showing up the first day. You had to be vaccinated 3 days before you showed up, and then I'm sorry, not vaccinated. You had to be tested for COVID 3 days before you showed up, and then you had to be tested again the day before you arrived on set. And then after that, you had to be tested every 3 days during the shoot. So that's a lot of testing, and SAG would not budge. We begged them to let us have, less testing because the bigger budget productions, they have people come and administer tests on set, but we couldn't afford that. Like we had to, use Walgreens and do the free drugstore testing, and that meant we had to have people leave that during the day, and a lot of our days were 12-hour days. So when I found out that we were going to have everyone leave, go to the drugstore, get tested, and come back. I thought, there's no way we can do this because that's going to eat up so much of the day. That there were basically 2 days where people had to get tested on a day where we were shooting. And I just racked my brain and I thought, there's got to be some way to do this. And the solution that I came up with was to hire another production assistant whose job would solely be to show up on those 2 days and to just be the chauffeur that drove people to the drugstore, got them tested, and drove them back. And once we found someone who was willing to do that, shout out to Ren Doris, who had the most thankless job in the world. They literally drove everyone to get tested and back. We were able to schedule it so we could do it in the time that we needed.
Well, I'm glad to hear it worked, seemed to have worked out. I mean, did you find yourself having to like stagger people's schedules and that kind of thing? What was that
Yeah,
scheduling an issue? Yeah.
everything had to be scheduled. Well, for one thing, actors always have a lot of downtime on a shoot day because there are just going to be times where they're not needed. Even if they're in every scene, actors spend time waiting while things get set up. So it was pretty easy to schedule time for the actors to go get tested, but for the key kind of department heads and for me, we all went on our lunch break. It was like me, the DP, the sound mixer, and the AD. I think we all got tested, yeah, on our lunch break.
Beyond those unique sets of challenges, I'm curious what other more general challenges you ran into on this film. And you said that this was your fourth feature, is that right?
Yeah, it's
Right.
my fourth feature. So I think the biggest challenge was just trying to get it done in the amount of time that we had. 11 days is not a lot of time for a 97-minute feature film, but it was all the time that we need. It was all the time that we needed. It wasn't like we were rushing through anything, but we had to be really smart about how we did it. So again, my producer Aaron really understood this. He allowed us to shoot in his home, which is in the suburbs of Chicago, and his house basically stood in for every other location outside of the main location. Early on in the film, there are scenes where the two sisters are coming from out of town, Wisconsin and Iowa. Well, Wisconsin and Iowa are both Skokie, Illinois in the film. We grabbed a shot of an apartment building in another suburb in Wilmette, Illinois, to be the exterior of Yvonne's apartment, which is supposedly in Madison. But when it cuts to the interior and she and her girlfriend are in bed together, that's Aaron's house in Skokie. That is the same house that her sister leaves from, where she kisses her husband goodbye, and gets in the car and drives. So like this, shooting Norma, leaving to drive to Chicago, and then driving back at the end. We got all of that in about an hour, hour to 2 hours. We got into the car with Norma. We got onto the highway. We drove 2 stops, got off at an exit, parked in a parking lot to a shopping mall. She changed her shirt, in the car, and then we drove back and then filmed her driving back. So just being able to use like one location as multiple locations, that was kind of um, how we were able to do it.
And this may be a too specific a question. It might be more of a broader thing to talk about. But were there any specific lessons, let's say, that you learned from on previous features when things, challenges came up that you were able to directly apply on this one? I don't know if there's anything specific like that, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, there's it's hard to summarize what I did right in a way that's concise, because if I could do it, then that's how everyone would do it the first time. You know what I mean? If there was like one magic bullet answer to how to make a no budget film, I mean, there's a million ways to make a movie, and they're all the right way and they're all the wrong way. It's
Right.
like however you're able to make it work, is the right way to do it. But I would say, as a director, I think I've learned how to um, just relax and to create an environment where everybody else feels relaxed and is able to do their best work. When I was younger, on my first couple features, I didn't have a lot of experience. So I, felt insecure. And I think I tried to kind of bluff like I had more confidence than I actually did, because I thought, oh, if people can see how insecure I am, then they're not going to trust me. Um, and after my third feature and definitely on the fourth, I felt like I was just operating from a place of genuine confidence, on the, and I think I've gotten better, I would say, at sort of managing other people's expectations. Like, I really try hard to communicate to the cast and the crew in advance what it's going to be like, so they'll know. And sometimes that's just as simple as me telling them, how fast it's going to go. Like, we had a table read 3 days before we started shooting, where a lot of the cast were kind of meeting each other for the first time. And I kind of told everyone, I said, look, I don't like to do a lot of takes and I don't like to get a lot of coverage, but I that doesn't mean, that we're going to rush through it. If we need more takes, we'll keep going until I feel like it's perfect. But if I say I have what I need and uh, I'm ready to move on, then, you all should feel good about what you did. You should know that I loved it. So just saying things like that, which seems kind of intuitive, that's the kind of thing that I think inspires confidence in your collaborators.
Yeah, it's funny because I talk with a lot of filmmakers about improv filmmaking. We talk about, improvisation, and and something I always say is that often when that word is mentioned in relation to filmmaking, it's thought of in terms of performance. I guess kind of going back to like John Cassavetes, developing the script with actors and through the improv process. But I also like to think of how improvisation can come into the problem solving process
Yeah,
behind the scenes. So it's not something that you're trying out things just for the sake of trying it out, but it's more like when a problem comes up, it's being able to deal with it on the spot. I'm
yeah.
curious if you feel that that applies to your process at all.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, um, and that's, that kind of is also something that I've learned over time is, you have to let the movie be what it wants to be. You can't try too hard to impose your own preconceived ideas about how you're going to shoot something. Um, no matter how well prepared you are, things are always different when you're on set and all that equipment is there and all those people are there. It's probably going to feel different than when you were just visiting that location by yourself. And so something I always try and ask myself is like, what's the best way to do this scene, or what's the best way to do this shot based on the way things look right now. Forget about what's on paper, forget about the shot list, forget about the script. Like, how do we make the best film that we can make? And I'll just give you one example. I really loved working with my cinematographer, Olivia Aquilina, who really had a lot of great ideas, I think, about how to shoot this film. And she loved the script. So she really understood, what I was wanting to explore. And the shot where the family gathers in front of the hearth and gets their photograph taken, and then they all leave to go to the graduation ceremony. We do this weird thing where the camera pans 360 degrees around the room, and then it ends with them walking back through the door as if, you know, a few hours have passed and they're coming back from the graduation. So there's no cut. And that's a weird thing to do, because we're suggesting time has passed when in reality, 30 seconds have passed with no cut. And my original idea was somewhat different. I originally wanted to pan only about 90 degrees over to a window and just stop at the window. And I wanted to see the family walk past the window and then have them come back. And it was Olivia's idea. She said, why don't we just keep going and just circle all the way around so that when we come back to where we started, that's when they'll walk back through the door. You know, um, and I just thought that was a brilliant idea for two reasons. First of all, that room is round. The Victorian home where we shot, it's got, it's a turret. So doing a circular pan felt natural because it felt like the camera was kind of following the natural contours of the space. But it also reminded me of like the hands on a clock, moving around in a circular fashion. And the passage of time is something that is I wanted to explore in the film on a thematic level. I wanted it to be about, how families change over time. And as soon as Olivia said that, I said, okay, let's do it. And like we didn't talk about why we were going to do it, what it meant, but that's what it meant to me, and I'm sure it meant something similar to her. And that was actually the day before we started shooting, because that was the first day of shooting, and she and I met in the house the night before to kind of just talk through the shot list. And when she said that to me, I just thought, man, she's the right person to do this. And then every time she had a suggestion between then and the end of the shoot, I always agreed with her. I always said, yep, let's do it.
That's
So
great
it
to
was a
hear.
good.
Yeah, that's great to hear. It was such a collaborative approach there, and the ideas that can come out of that. It's also an interesting example of how the location itself shaped some of the ideas, and in this case, I guess, inspired the idea of, like you said, kind of panning around just almost because of the shape of the house itself. I'm curious, did you find spending all that time in the location, did you find it influencing your thought process, the creative process in other ways, just as you become more and more familiar with that space and spend more time in it?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm pretty fanatical about trying to find interesting locations. Like that's a big deal to me. I never want to shoot somewhere just because I have access to it. Like to me, the physical spaces that we're shooting in have to, somehow chime with, what's on paper. And sometimes I'm lucky enough to write for locations that I know we can get, but oftentimes I'm not. And so, when I wrote the first draft of the script, it was described as just being a two-story Victorian house. And then when we got permission to shoot there, I made a lot of changes to the script based on what I knew it looked like. I'll give you another example. The fight scene between Benji and Rod, Rod is on a second floor balcony when Benji comes walking home, and they're yelling up and down at each other. Well, I didn't know there was going to be a second floor balcony. So in the original script, they were both on the front porch. Rod was smoking a bowl, and his brother walked up and they were yelling at each other, on the front porch. But as soon as we saw that little tiny second floor balcony, I thought we have to use that. And that, that scene seemed like the best way to use that location, because I just thought having an argument with people sort of yelling up and down at each other was just a more visually interesting way to show the conflict between those characters.
Yeah, it definitely enhances, I think, the distance, the tension between them. That's interesting that was another moment like that where it was kind of born out of the possibilities of the location. I'm curious, as production. So you filmed, you said, for 11 days. So it sounds like it was mostly into the early summer of 2021.
Yeah.
From at what? So after you wrapped up shooting and moving on to post production, what was your schedule like for that? And I guess going into that, could you talk a little bit about your approach to the post production, what that involved, and anything that may have come out of that creatively as well?
Yeah, well, I'm really lucky that I have a really close relationship with my editor, Eric Marsh. He had cut the film that I had made prior to this, called Rendezvous in Chicago, and he and I really got along very well. We're both cinephiles. We both love film history, and we share a very similar frame of reference. I remember even working on Rendezvous, he would say, "Oh, we could kind of do a thing here where it'd be like something from a Bresson film," and it was like I instantly knew what he meant. And I said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, do that." So that kind of shorthand is what you really want to have with all of your collaborators, if possible. Although oftentimes it doesn't happen, especially with the crew, because even today, it's sort of like it's kind of hard to find cinematographers who are cinephiles, which sounds crazy to me. But when you think about it, people go to film school to learn how to be cinematographers, but it isn't because they love traditional movies. Today, people are likely to go into that profession because they like music videos, they like, you know, television shows, they like web series, and they also know that that's going to be how they end up making money. So, so the fact that Eric and I are both kind of obsessed with film history makes things a lot easier, just in terms of being able to communicate. So he cuts really fast, and also because I don't shoot a lot of footage, there's kind of only one way to cut my scenes together. Like we don't cover everything from multiple angles. It's like pretty much what you see in the movie, that's the angle we get that moment from. So there's only one way to kind of put all these shots together end to end. But having said all that, I also am not present when he creates the rough cut because, there even with shooting minimal coverage, there are a lot of different ways to do things, and I like to be surprised. I always feel like um, if I'm there, I'm going to do it the way that I see it in my head. But if I'm not there, he's going to do things that will surprise me in a good way. And if he does things that surprise me in a way that's not good, I can always say, "Oh no, do X, Y, and Z instead." So I always, I also teach directing, I should say, at a couple of colleges. And I always tell my students, don't edit your own films, like have somebody else do it. It's just always going to be better if you have another set of eyes on your film. And if you don't like what they do, I mean, you can always tell them to undo it or to do something else, because as the director, you're going to be sitting there. You're going to ultimately approve everything by the time you get to the final cut. And so the time for you to not be there is really in the beginning, I think.
I'm curious, coming from the background with your interest in film history, that's something I always find really interesting because I kind of have that same, it's always sort of been a parallel interest for me along with filmmaking. I'm curious how you find or if you find that influences your thinking about how to do things on the set. Do you find that there's a lot of crossover, kind of drawing on ideas of certain directors, certain styles? And when you're on the set, do you find that there's a lot of influences that come in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I kind of fell in love with film history back in the 1980s when I was a child. And, just by renting, VHS tapes at the video store. And so, I think every filmmaker has their own, you know, sense of what film language is, based on all the movies that you've seen. Like your sense of film vocabulary in terms of how to shoot something, how to edit something. It's based on everything that you've seen. And so I think filmmakers who are cinephiles are going to have more, they're going to have a broader range of knowledge. You're going to have more tools at your disposal the more that you're aware of. Um, so yeah, I mean, I always, and even, before I make a movie, I'll usually watch movies in order to sort of figure out what I'm doing, because like I said, I wanted to make a movie about a family, so I'm going to ask myself, well, who's done that the best? And the answer, of course, is Yasujiro Ozu, the Japanese director. He made the best movies ever about parent-child relationships. So, of course, I went back and I watched Late Spring and some of his other great films from the late 40s and early 50s, even though they're set in, post-war Japan, where the culture is very different. I mean, it's still it's as universal and timeless as Shakespeare, you know. And then, Claire, who not only plays Yvonne but co-produced the movie, she recommended to me Jonathan Demme's film Rachel Getting Married with Anne Hathaway, which I had never seen. She said, "Oh, this is kind of similar to what you want to do. You should watch this." So I did, and it was absolutely helpful. And I like Jonathan Demme a lot. I think he's a great director. But I had never seen that movie, and I watched it, and I thought, yeah, this is helpful because there are a lot of scenes in that movie. Again, it's sort of like a family, reunion movie set around a wedding, and yet there are these kind of musical interludes that feel like a documentary at times, like where people will sing or play music or dance. And then the way it sort of transitions from that to more scripted dialogue scenes, it feels very effortless. And that was absolutely, that absolutely ended up being an influence.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear about that. I actually taught film history briefly and myself, and what I was always, sometimes I would encounter, some resistance about the how applicable the learning of film history was in relation to production. And I think that, as you're saying, there's so much that you can learn from watching, even beyond the history itself, but just simply watching the films and seeing even if it's again made in an entirely different time and a different culture, there's so much that's timeless and transcends any of those kinds of differences, and you never know how it can come up as you're thinking about creative challenges to a movie. So I'm always, a big advocate of that idea of just trying to see as much as you can, and whether you learn from it directly or not. But like you said, it kind of expands the vocabulary, the cinematic vocabulary that we all can draw on.
Absolutely. And, the fact that there are people who make movies, especially who direct, who are not cinephiles, that makes no sense to me. Like that only exists in filmmaking. It doesn't exist in the other arts. Like go ask a painter how they feel about the history of painting, and you're going to hear a lot. Every painter spends a lot of time studying the history of painting. Same thing with literature. Go ask a writer. What they think about 19th century Russian literature. They're going to have opinions. They're going to tell you what they think about Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Turgenev and Gogol. But if you ask a film director, what do you think about silent Russian cinema? They're not going to know what to say. Except maybe, I had to watch Battleship Potemkin in a class in college. Um, which is crazy, that there are some directors like that. I don't understand it.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's just there's so much to learn, so much to draw on, and anything that expands the toolkit, so to speak, the vocabulary of that all filmmakers can. It is almost a kind of universal language, universal form of communication. Um, I wanted to ask, it just kind of in the time that we have left here. I don't want to go on too long here, but I did want to ask you about the Chicago Film Project. I was reading about this. I believe it was involved in the production of your film, and it sounds like an interesting project. I was wondering if you could share some information about that.
Yeah, I was super lucky to get involved with those folks, because Chicago Film Project is an independent film production company in Chicago, and they're basically like the film production arm of a magazine called New City. So when you watch Relative, that's the first thing you see is the New City Chicago Film Project logo. And before they produced my film, they produced three other independent feature films, two of which were phenomenally successful. The first film they produced is called Signature Move, and that premiered at South by Southwest, which was a great success story. And then the next film they produced, Knives and Skin, same director, Jennifer Reeder, that premiered at the Berlin International Film Festival, which is even bigger. So of course I wanted to, become involved with them, because there aren't a whole lot of, production companies in Chicago. There aren't a whole lot of production entities. There are a lot of independent filmmakers, but I approached them about collaborating on this script, and they told me they liked the script, but they weren't really sure because, again, this was kind of the early days of COVID, and I think they weren't really sure what was going to happen. And I had already raised, some of the money that I needed to make the film. And I kind of said to them, okay, I'm going to make this movie. And I said, when I'm done shooting it, I know I'm going to need more to finish. And I said, so I'm going to circle back to you all. And they said, okay, great. And, so I sort of stayed in touch with them throughout the production process. Like when we would cast somebody, like when we cast Wendy Roby, I remember sending an email and saying, "Oh, just so you know, I cast Wendy Roby as the mom." And they wrote me back and they said, "Oh, Wendy's fantastic," because she had been in one of their films. So I just sort of kept the channels of communication open. And then when in post production, my editor, because he's a friend of mine, he basically did a rough cut on deferred pay, because we had no money for post at all. We had just enough to get through shooting. And then I sent a rough cut to Chicago Film Project and I said, look, we need X amount of dollars for post production only. I would love, to be able to put your logo at the top of this movie, if you're interested in, coming on board and investing and co-producing. And um, fortunately, they watched it and they loved it. They said, we want to have a Zoom meeting with you. There was one scene in the film they were kind of unsure of. They suggested that I think about cutting, and I did. I said, well, I'll try and cut this one weird dream sequence and see how I feel about it. And I cut it and I realized, damn, they're right. It plays better without that scene. So it was pretty much as simple as that. And the other thing was they wanted to be involved in festival and distribution strategy. And of course, that was really appealing to me as well, because in the past, I've just done that on my own. It's just me cold emailing festivals, just blind submitting on Film Freeway. And so I think having Chicago Film Project on board definitely opened some doors for us in terms of festivals, in terms of screening at indie theaters, because we played, I think there were 87 theatrical screenings of this movie in 17 different states in the US, plus Toronto, Ontario. Are you in Baltimore? Is that right, Matt?
Yes, I am. Yep.
Okay. Sadly, Maryland was not one of the states where we played. Hopefully, the next one will play there. But just having Chicago Film Project on board made that a lot easier. And then and now we're the digital release just happened through Music Box Films, and they're a really well-known distributor, independent film distributor. They mostly do European films, and they distributed the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo trilogy, the original Swedish films, and that was kind of what put them on the map. And so Brian, my executive producer, who is one of the Chicago Film Project folks, he already had a relationship with them, and they fortunately they liked the movie, and I think they kind of understood what to do with it.
Great. I want to mention that you were the author of the book that I really enjoyed, Flickering Empire, about the early years of the Chicago film industry. And I wanted to ask you real quick if you could, if you see any connections between those early years of as the film business was just starting in the U.S. and how what an important role Chicago played in that, if you see any kind of lineage from that to, the indie film scene in Chicago today, if you could, anything you'd like to say about that, I'd be interested to hear.
Absolutely. Well, it's always kind of the same thing. It's just like film history is just the same things happen over and over again in cycles. And the book that I wrote, Flickering Empire, with my friend Adam Seltzer, who's a historian, is really about the birth of cinema. 1890. It really begins with the World's Fair, 1893, and it goes up through about 1917. It was really before Hollywood became Hollywood. You know, the premise of our book is that Chicago was really the mainstream center of the American film industry before everything moved to the West Coast. And so there were two large studios here in Chicago on the north side, very close to where I am right now. One was called SNA and one was called Selig Polyscope. And then beyond that, there were a lot of independent films being made. So I do think it's very similar to today, because I'm an independent filmmaker, and I'm just trying to figure out a way to do it in the margins. And in particular, one of my heroes is a director, is an African American filmmaker who got his start in the silent era, a guy named Oscar Michaud. And I don't want to compare myself to him too much because he had, the odds that he had to overcome not only as an independent filmmaker, but as a black man in America making feature films in the 1920s, it's just impossible to fathom. But reading about his life story, when doing research for this book, it was enormously inspirational to me because I realized I'm kind of doing the same thing. This was a guy who, he raised money independently just by going to his neighbors, just door to door, selling shares in his, the film that he was going to make in the future, collecting all the money, making the film, and then traveling around literally in his car with prints of his films and posters in the trunk, going theater to theater, around the country. And, that's basically what we did for Relative. Out of those 87 screenings that I told you about, I was present for 47 of them. So I, was trying to do my sort of 21st century version of that. I was doing a lot more flying, but I had to be, I was taking red eye flights and I was only going to cities where I knew people, where I could crash on someone's couch. And so, yeah, I did feel a sense of, solidarity with a lot of those, enterprising independent filmmakers who got their start in the silent era.
Yeah, I think it's so important with independent film, to be our own, biggest advocates for our work, to get the word out however we can. It's one of the reasons I do these interviews, is just to help to give people a chance to talk about the films and to kind of create a or contribute to the record of these films out there and help people find them. So yeah, I certainly appreciate that. Yeah, I just also want to say it's interesting thinking about Chicago's role in the early film industry, because that's something I'm always struck by in reading about the early years. Is before New York and of course especially LA became really solidified as production centers, that there was so much regional production through
Yeah,
the U.S. Philadelphia, Florida,
Florida.
yeah,
Yeah,
all these different, and in a way, I think today the industry, the biggest established parts of the industry do have a way of kind of overshadowing how much regional production still goes on. I mean, mostly
yeah.
at an independent level, but there is still so much out there, and it's just a matter of again finding it, being aware of it, and getting the word out.
Absolutely. And, I'm just so grateful for the film festival circuit and for independently owned movie theaters, which a lot of people don't realize how many theaters are out there that are willing to take a chance on an independent filmmaker. If you just email them and say, look, here's the movie I made, here's the poster, here's the trailer, here's what critics have said, here are the awards we've won, do you want to show our film? Um, it's surprising how many people are willing to do it, especially if you can go there to do a Q&A. The reason why I traveled so extensively with Relative was because I knew we were going to sell more tickets if I was there. And the theater owners know that as well. I mean, it's kind of a tumultuous time in the industry where a lot of theaters are, they're not selling a lot of tickets to a lot of the studio films that they're showing. So they're willing to take a chance. And uh, I had a great experience in some of the places we went. Santa Fe, New Mexico. I think there were 66 people in the audience, for our one show there. There were 60 people in Minneapolis, Minnesota, coming to see, my little film. And I'm also really grateful to people like you, who give a platform to independent filmmakers.
I'm glad to hear that the response to Relative has been good, and it sounds like it's been a really positive experience for you. And I certainly enjoyed seeing the film. And before we sign off, is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you'd like to mention, or any upcoming projects that you'd like to plug?
Well, since I made Relative, I've actually made two short films. I'm trying to get another feature off the ground, and the budget's higher considerably than Relative. So, that's always the struggle. And in the meantime, I made a short last year called Paper Planes that I co-directed with my friend Alyssa, and then this year I made a short called Handle with Care, which is kind of playing festivals right now. So, uh, so anybody who's watching this, keep your eyes peeled for Handle with Care. I plan on keeping that, in festivals until the end of the year. And I just want to encourage folks to support, independent cinema. It's really, really important, I think, to support independent films if we want to have a healthy film culture. Um, and anyone who's interested in checking out Relative, it's available on a variety of platforms, but the best place to go is our distributor's website, musicboxfilms.com. They have all of the platforms, links to all of the platforms on their website.
Great. Well, Michael, thanks again for speaking with me today. It was a pleasure, and I hope people check out your film. And best of luck with your upcoming projects.
Thank you so much for having me.